The Mandalorians. Ruthless, brutal, and notorious. When you look at them, the first things that come to mind are usually three things: their armor, their fighting skills, and most of all, their unique helmets. Throughout Star Wars, we've seen many different types of Mandalorian helmets, each with different designs and a different story behind each mask. So in this video, we're going to break down each and every type of Mandalorian helmet, and as the list goes on, you might be surprised at some of them. So let's get right into it. Taungs. Entering our first type of Mandalorian helmet, we have Taungs. However, the name Taung actually comes from a species who were the ancestors of the Mandalorians. Taungs were a near-human species native to Coruscant that were around just about 30,000 years before the events of A New Hope. Around this time, the Taungs discovered a planet that would later be named Mandalore, and so they slaughtered the large mythosaur beast to claim the world as their home. One warrior in specific named himself Mandalore I, and so he named the planet after himself, calling it Mandalore. Mandalore I then became the earliest known user of what was called the ceremonial mask. These masks were modeled to look similar to the facial features of the Taung species, and were technically the first Mandalorian helmets ever. However, here's the big catch. While most Mandalorian helmets today are made from Beskar, the Taung-inspired helmets are actually made from the bones of the great mythosaur beast. In order to get these bones, they had to kill the mythosaur with their swords and axes, that way they could make these helmets. So, once they did, they designed the helmets to match the Taung's angular facial structure and pronounced brow ridges. Although it's not confirmed, many believe that these early designs likely inspired the later Mandalorian helmets, as they also had that similar T-visor shaped look to it. Unfortunately though, in time, the Taung species eventually died out and were soon replaced with humans, which now enters our next category. Crusaders. Entering our next variation of helmet, we have the Crusader helmets. Years after conquering Mandalore, Mandalore I established what were called the Mandalorian Crusaders, the very first documented type of Mandalorians. The Crusaders were all about gaining honor and glory in combat, and let's just say their helmets represented just that. As this group was established, many early T-shaped visors began appearing, and each warrior forged their own personal variations. Each Crusader wore their own personal helmet to fit their preferences, and so they were unique to each and every one of them. Of course though, most of these helmets and suits were designed for personal combat, and they symbolized the Mandalorian culture by being warrior-like. The Crusaders ruled Mandalore with these helmets for many years, until one day things changed. In time, they almost became extinct after losing in a massive war against the Jedi and the Republic. So, that now leads us into our next group, Neo-Crusaders. Around 24,000 years before A New Hope, a new group of Mandalorians were founded called the Neo-Crusaders. Founded by Mandalore the Ultimate, this group was named after our last group, the Mandalorian Crusaders. However, these helmets were way different than the original Crusaders. Made by the warrior Cassis Fett, the Neo-Crusaders helmets look like this, and let's just say it was a huge upgrade. These helmets were designed to be sealed and integrated into the Mandalorian's chest armor and had fully enclosed neck protection. In their war against the Jedi at this time, these helmets were crucial as it helped protect them against blasters and lightsaber strikes. However, there was one big change compared to the others on our list. These helmets were color-coded based on your rank. Recruits wore blue helmets, rally masters wore crimson helmets, veterans wore silver helmets, and field marshals wore gold helmets. These helmets served the Mandalorians for many years until they eventually upgraded and brought in the Neo-Crusader shock troopers. These shock troopers had what the normal Neo-Crusaders had, but had many upgrades like enhanced armor and weaponry. On top of that, they also had external breathing apparatuses, enhanced sensors, and even better plating. Them along with the Neo-Crusaders helped serve the Mandalorians for years, and their helmets truly became a powerful symbol of the Mandalorian culture. Super Commandos. Next up, we have the Mandalorian Super Commando helmets, the most iconic and arguably the most popular style of Mandalorian helmets. Introduced about 20,000 years after our last group, the Super Commando armor came about, and they replaced the older armor. This type of armor was used by some of the most popular Mandalorians we know, like Din Djarin, Boba Fett, and Jango Fett. Unlike the previous helmets though, these ones returned to a more traditional T-visor proportion, and each helmet usually had heavy customization. From different colorways to markings and symbols, each helmet was unique in their own way. However, that's not all. Those that wore Super Commando helmets usually had their helmets match their armor, which really reflected their preference and styles. On their suits, they'd sometimes add different signets or emblems on their torso plates, so they could show allegiance to the clan they're a part of. On top of that, many Mandalorians would also add different accessories to their armor. Some accessories included utility belts, capes, and advanced weaponry like gauntlet flamethrowers, vibroblades, rocket launchers, and jetpacks. A great example of this is Din Djarin, as he had many different components to his armor that complemented his elite fighting style. Death Watch. Next on our list, we have the Death Watch helmets. These helmets started being introduced a bit before the Clone Wars and were prominent in the Mandalorian terrorist group called Death Watch. This group consisted of warriors that opposed the government of Mandalore, and their helmets represented just that. Now at first glance, Death Watch helmets look almost identical to the Super Commando helmets, and while they're similar in some ways, they are a bit different. These helmets were known for their standardized blue and gray color scheme, and if you look closely you can see that their T-visor has a more aggressive and more pronounced style. The Death Watch helmets were meant to represent their rejection of the pacifist rule at the time, as this clan was known for their aggression and deadly tactics. However, unlike most Mandalorian armor, Death Watch armor contained a lot less of the Beskar material. At this time period, Beskar was scarce due to high demand, so this group's armor wasn't as strong as most, which in time contributed to their downfall. Mandalorian Guards. Entering our next helmet, we have the Mandalorian Guard, or in other words, the Mandalorian Police. This group was known for upholding the law and order on Mandalore, and had a very unique armor style compared to the others we've spoken about. Mandalorian Guards were known for their gray color scheme, but instead of being designed for combat, their helmets and armor were designed for security. Their helmets didn't have a full face covering either, as the design itself was inspired by Corinthian-style helmets. Sadly, on top of that, the Mandalorian Guards didn't have many accessories or add-ons to their gear. The only things they did have were stun batons and large shields, as their primary duty was just to enforce the law and ensure public safety. So in a way, you can kind of consider them to be peacekeepers, and their helmets reflected that. The Mauldalorians. Entering our next helmet, we have the Maul Super Commando helmets, or also known as the Mauldalorian helmets. This group were loyalists to Maul during his time when he ruled on Mandalore. These helmets were mostly all repainted to red, while some had a mix of gray and black colorways as well. Unlike most Mandalorian helmets though, these helmets had horns at the top of their heads, and this was done to represent Maul's heritage as a Zabrak species. However, despite all these additions, they still kept that Super Commando base structure, but definitely looked more intimidating. Some of the Mauldalorians even added their own unique designs to their helmets, such as scars across their face or even yellow visors. Now, while this group wasn't around for long, they proved their loyalty to Maul on multiple occasions, and their helmet designs were definitely one of the ways. Nite Owls. Led by Bo-Katan Kryze, Nite Owls were a group of Mandalorians that refused to follow Maul's rule. Originally, this group was a part of Death Watch, but when Maul rose to power, they broke off and formed what they called the Nite Owls. While there were a few males in this group, we mainly see females, and Bo-Katan's helmet is definitely one of the more symbolic ones. Her helmet had a more angular and winged T-visor, and also had a design that resembled an owl. Bo-Katan's helmet specifically also had many features, like a targeting rangefinder, a macro binocular viewplate, and a comlink. The colorways used by this group were usually blue, black, and white, which signified their breakaway from Maul's rule. Imperial Super Commandos. Entering our next helmet, we have the Imperial Super Commando helmets. These helmets belong to the Mandalorian soldiers that were loyal to the Empire after they rose to power. Led by the soldier Gar Saxon, these helmets showcase a different style to the original Super Commando helmets, and usually only had one prime color. Gar Saxon himself wore all red, but his troopers wore a predominantly white color made from Beskar. This white and red color scheme was meant to represent their loyalty to the Empire, and if you look closely at their armor, you'll even notice the Imperial symbol they each wore on their arm as well. This design, however, was actually made to represent Stormtrooper armor, and that's kind of why it's mainly a white color. It was designed to blend both Mandalorian and Imperial styles together, forming this new look. Sadly though, you never see many unique designs on this armor, as there really was no individuality. As an Imperial Super Commando, you were purely just a soldier and nothing more. Mandalorian Protectors. Entering our next helmet, we have the Mandalorian Protector helmets. These helmets once belonged to the Mandalorian Protectors, which was an organization formed that included former Mandalorian police and Death Watch members. Most of their helmets were primarily designed with green markings and accents, which gave a more traditional Mandalorian colorway. On top of that, their armor did have a lot of advantages. In their helmets, they had a pilot focus integration, a built-in breathing apparatus, vacuum-capable systems, and reinforced visor plating. Not only that, but the Protectors also had their own symbol that they'd place on either their helmets or chest plates. That way they could showcase their loyalty to their group. Post-Imperial. As for our next helmet, we have the Post-Imperial helmets. Helmets that were used by the Mandalorians after the Empire collapsed. Now, unlike the others on this list though, these helmets were probably the most diverse type of helmets we've seen, mainly because they were all really just made out of scraps. After the Empire destroyed and bombed Mandalore, the Mandalorian survivors were stuck, so they had to find new ways to make armor. So they got whatever scraps they could and got to work. In time, many of these survivors formed a new clan called the Tribe and built their helmets purely for protection and strength. These helmets were made from Beskar material as well as a few other alloys and were all highly polished with a metallic finish. On top of that, they also kept that classic T-visor proportion and allowed each Mandalorian to have their own unique personalization to their helmets. However, there was just one downfall. Under the Way of the Mandalore, which was a tradition practiced by them, they weren't allowed to remove their helmets in front of others. This rule was extremely strict to their culture, and if you did break this rule, you'd be banished from their tribe. The only way to redeem yourself was to bathe inside the living waters of Mandalore, which is what we saw Din Djarin himself do. With that, however, that concludes our list of every single type of Mandalorian helmet. But I want to know from you, out of all the helmet designs on this list, which is your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you always.